Good morning and welcome to part three of this risk prevention series, Violence Prevention, Responding to Threats of Harm to Others. We are excited to have Kristen DiConstanzo, a risk prevention specialist for Fairfax County Public Schools, and Sergeant Brett Choice, School Resource Officer Supervisor. Now we'll turn it to you guys.
Great, thank you, Nadia. Hello, my name is Kristen DiCostanzo, and good morning. This is part three of the risk prevention series, Violence Prevention, Responding to Threats of Harm to Others. I'm here with Sergeant Choice.
Good morning. I'm Sergeant Brett Choice with the Fairfax County Police Department. I'm the School Resource Officer Supervisor and Police Liaison to the Fairfax County Public Schools for risk assessment oversight.
So our learning objectives for this morning are for caregivers to learn the research behind targeted violence and more specifically the pathway towards violence. Caregivers will become more familiar with the threat to others concerning behaviors risk assessment within Fairfax County Public Schools. And lastly, Sergeant Choice and I will review supportive in-school, at-home, and community measures to keeping students safe. So before we get started on the research behind targeted violence, I'd like to review the goal and purpose of risk prevention. Part one, risk prevention overview, and part two, suicide prevention, also touched on these concepts, and I encourage you to view those recordings as well if you haven't already. The goal of risk prevention is to maintain the health, safety, and well-being of the school community. The purpose of risk prevention is to connect the identified at-risk student with the appropriate interventions and supports. Up until this point in the risk prevention series, we have reviewed how this is done via the threat to self risk assessment. Part three, violence prevention, will review how this is done through the threat to others concerning behaviors risk assessment. So today we will be touching on sensitive topics such as targeted violence and suicide. These topics can elicit very strong emotions, and if at any point you need to step away, remember this presentation is recorded and materials will be sent to you. 988 is a great resource for mental health support for both adults and children in the event you need to speak to somebody. Additionally, we're going to be addressing general questions at the end of the training once the recording has stopped. If you have any questions specific to your child, we'll be sharing resources and directions at the end of the training to get those specific questions answered. Now I'll hand it over to Sergeant Choice.
Why we conduct risk assessments. School risk assessments are conducted to proactively identify, assess, and manage situations or students who may pose a violent risk of violence or harm, with the primary goal of preventing incidents from occurring by intervening early and providing necessary supports, such as early intervention. The main purpose is to detect potential threats early on before they escalate into violent acts. Number two, multidisciplinary approach. A team of educators, administrators, clinicians, and law enforcement who work together to gather information and analyze potential threats. Number three, fact-based analysis. Risk assessments rely on concrete evidence and information from various sources to make informed decisions about the severity of the threat. And number four, individualized response plans. Based on the assessment, appropriate interventions can be implemented, including clinical services, monitoring, safety plans, and collaboration with parents. Research on targeted violence. Targeted violence is defined as a premeditated act of violence directed at a specific individual, group, or location, regardless of the motivation, and generally unrelated to other criminal activity. Research has shown that acts of violence are rarely spontaneous and impulsive. There is often an identifiable progression or pathway for long periods of time. Early identification, mitigation, intervention, and support can prevent targeted violence. This video is from the Sandy Hook Promise and may be disturbing to some. It is not about a real incident. The pathway to violence starts with grievances, which may be real or a perceived sense of loss, mistreatment, or injustice. Then it goes to ideation, is the expression of the thoughts or fantasies regarding the use of violence to address a real or perceived grievance. Then it moves to planning, giving thought and consideration on how to commit violence. Then preparation, develop or acquire the capability to cause harm to the intended targets or victims, and ends with implementation. The subject initiates the operationalized plan once reaching a point where they perceive themselves as capable of doing so. Capability is based on the subject's perceived skill to cause harm and their will to do so. The factors that turn an idea into action on the pathway to violence is: one, justification. The person feels justified in using violence to address grievances. Number two, alternatives. The person perceives no alternatives to violence to address grievances, running out of options. Consequences. The person accepts the consequences of acting violently. And then lastly, ability. The person perceives their ability to engage in violence, the belief in their own ability is a strong predictor in human performance, including violence. Vulnerabilities. Presence of these concerns, behaviors, presence of these concerns, behaviors, and circumstances can increase an individual's vulnerability to the pathway behaviors, or if someone is already on the pathway towards violence, they may prompt them to implementation of targeted violence. When we see these in adolescence, we can use empathy while providing interventions and services. As parents or trusted adults, enabling, hiding, or defending these symptoms, behaviors, or circumstances can have dire consequences. Common indicators. These are some common indicators or observable warnings that an individual may be on the pathway to violence. The presence of any of these indicators would likely prompt a school to conduct a risk assessment for threat of harm to others or for concerning behaviors. It is important to consider the totality of the person's circumstances when observing potential indicators. The presence of one or more of these indicators does not necessarily mean that individual will engage in targeted violence. However, when observed in context or in combination with other suspicious behaviors, one or more of these indicators may raise suspicion in a reasonable person and constitute a basis for reporting to law enforcement and the conducting of a risk assessment within the school setting. Some examples are developing or communicating goals or plans to commit a violent act, such as engaging in threatening interactions with others or violently refusing to comply with adults, communicating in person or online with an intent to engage in violence or a direct threat with justification, expressing acceptance of violence as a necessary means to achieve goals, frequent jokes threatening specific violence against a person, place, group, or people. Number two, acquiring or developing skills, knowledge, or resources to engage in targeted violence, such as stalking behaviors of a person, place, or group, attempting to obtain or researching how to acquire weapons, increased use of online concealment tactics, conducting research for a target or tactical selection, hiding money or purchases of resources to prepare for a violent act. Number three, interactions with others, including family members or other individuals with grievances, such as increase in verbalizing of grievances, developing a lack of trust, abnormal violent responses, unusual goodbyes, hate ideology, aligning with violent extremists, or fixation on target-specific groups. And last, seclusion from others they once trusted and activities they once enjoyed. And then number 4, developing or communicating the justification of violent acts, such as fixation or admiration of past violent extremist attackers or school shooters. Demonstrate support for violent extremist ideology.
Thank you, Brett. Now we've provided you a lot of very unsettling information, but I want to bring us back to the truth, which is that targeted violence is rare. And student safety and sense of belonging is always at the forefront of what we are trying to do at school. So as we dive into the topic of targeted violence and the understandable anxiety it elicits, again, I want to remind everyone that statistically targeted violence is rare and school communities continue to be a safe place for students to be in. This is true due to processes like the risk assessment, the mental health, social, emotional, and behavioral supports that are available in school and in the community. And as I stated in the first part of the series several weeks ago, research shows that behavioral threat assessment and management, or as FCPS calls it, its risk assessments, work in keeping staff and students safe from individuals who have found themselves on the pathway to violence due to a culmination of risk factors and circumstances. And the supports that are afforded as a result of the risk assessment, when conducted with fidelity and purposefully, can result in that individual moving off the pathway to violence and onto a more pro-social way of life, which is the whole point of our risk assessment. Okay. This slide illustrates data obtained from the Fairfax County Youth Survey, which is taken by all 8th, 10th, and 12th grade graders anonymously. These data points on the slide relate to safety within the school setting. It's important that we know this information as it provides insight into its impact on attendance, mental health, and wellness of our students, and with respect to risk prevention, the development of grievances, which is what Sergeant Choice spoke about shortly. As you can see, overall, the vast majority of those who completed the survey feel safe at school, 83% feel safe at school. I've added the bullying and harassment data because research shows that those who have engaged in targeted violence most often cite bullying and harassment as their motive or their grievance for engaging in the targeted violent act. FCPS proactively collects this information, and there are supports and protocols in place for students who feel as if they are targeted. They are the target of bullying and harassment. Though we obviously wish that those data points reflected 0%, it is clear that overall school remains a safe place for the majority of students. It is due to processes like the risk assessment that we can maintain that sense of security. The first step to prevention is the reporting of concerns. I'm going to reference the video we watched earlier, how many warning signs were present before that fake school shooting. This is true for real acts of targeted violence as well. There are sometimes weeks, months, years worth of warning signs prior to any act of targeted violence. As a caregiver of an FCPS student, what should you be reporting and how? And we're about to get into that. As reviewed in the first part of the series, Risk Prevention Overview, the FCPS risk prevention model is focused on 3 types of risk: threats of harm to self, threat of harm to others, and concerning behaviors. Identifying risk is the first step of the model. Risk exists whenever there has been reported threat of harm to self or harm to others. Risk also exists when there are other warning signs and are early stage concerning behaviors that are not contingent upon an explicit threat, but may pose a threat of future violence. Identifying risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors were addressed in part 2 of the risk prevention series, which I encourage all viewers to watch after this recording. This webinar is reviewing how FCPS assesses risk to threat to others and concerning behaviors. Who might report a threat or concern? Anybody. Students, FCPS staff members, families, community members, and the Fairfax County Police Department all participate in ensuring the safety of the school community. Therefore, these individuals are all able to report a concerning behavior or explicit or implicit threat towards the school community. As a caregiver, you would generally report your concerns to the school administration or police department. That is generally how you would report all threats that you may become aware of or all concerning behavior you have observed in your child or someone else's child. However, if you are hoping to report threats anonymously, there is the anonymous safety tip line that we have talked about in both part 1 and part 2 of the risk prevention series. So access to that reporting mechanism is listed on the slide. A report can be made online via the quick tip electronic form, via text message, or over the phone. Okay, on the next few slides, we're going to be reviewing the threat to others concerning behaviors risk assessment process and procedure within FCPS schools. A risk assessment is used to evaluate potential risks associated with a particular situation. Therefore, an identified threat will need to be present in order to conduct a risk assessment, or concerning or escalating behaviors are observed that indicate the student is on the pathway towards violence, which Brett discussed earlier. In addition to the identified threat or presentation of concerning behaviors, contextual factors also need to be present that indicate potential risk. When considering when a threat towards others risk assessment is appropriate, context matters. Risk prevention overview reviewed the contextual factors that schools consider when determining whether a risk assessment is appropriate. Again, we are looking at the totality of the circumstance, and that includes context. Again, part 1 of risk prevention series reviewed the contextual factors that are considered in this part of the risk assessment process. There are several avenues toward the conducting of a risk assessment. A student may self-report. That could include a student sharing that they are thinking about engaging in violence. It could be a result of a conversation related to something different, but as indicated, needed for follow-up, and that's evident. The student could be exhibiting observable concerning behaviors in school, in the community, or online that indicate that maybe they may be on the pathway towards violence, meaning they may have developed a grievance, they may have been engaging in ideation and the thought of violence to solve that grievance, planning behaviors, preparatory behaviors, all indicate that a student may be on the pathway towards violence. That would constitute a risk assessment. Staff reports could be in response to observable warning signs, a student's written work or drawings, which indicate a need for follow-up, or the student disclosing to a trusted adult within the school that they're having thoughts of aggression and or violence. Staff may report those instances that may result in a risk assessment for threat to others and concerning behaviors. Lastly, and no, this is not a comprehensive list, but for the sake of this slide, lastly, a community member, such as a caregiver, friend, or law enforcement officer, may also share with the school concerns related to something the individual stated, something that they posted online, or something written by the student or drawn by the student. Any indicators that an individual may pose a future threat to the school community would be taken seriously, and our school teams have the responsibility to err on the side of caution when a concern is made. They've been made aware of a concern. Okay, as a reminder, the goal of a risk assessment is to evaluate potential risks associated with a particular situation, and the purpose is to connect the identified at-risk youth with appropriate supports. Through this process, a risk assessment is the opportunity to ascertain overall level of risk by identifying risk factors and possible solutions and protective factors the school team can leverage in order to maintain the health and safety of the school community and that student. We reviewed risk factors and protective factors in part 1 of risk prevention overview. It is also the opportunity to get to know that student better. organize a multidisciplinary team to problem solve and collaborate on the creation of a supportive response plan. So what does this multidisciplinary team look like? The threat to others concerning behaviors risk assessment team includes a school administrator, school counselor, school psychologist, school social worker, and school resource officer and law enforcement. Again, in part one of risk prevention overview, I reviewed Code of Virginia section 22.1-79.4. For this legislation, each division superintendent shall establish of each school a threat assessment team that shall include persons with expertise in counseling, instruction, school administration, and law enforcement. When a risk assessment is being conducted in response to a threat to others or due to a pattern of escalation of concerning behaviors, each of these areas of expertise must be represented in order to provide that wraparound support that student needs and to ensure the overall safety of the school community. This is mandatory. And as a team, they work together not only to conduct that risk assessment, but to also create a support plan that's differentiated to the root cause of why that child may be engaging in these behaviors or making these threats.
The school and law enforcement partnership is written into Virginia law to ensure collaboration in assessing and mitigating students with health and safety risks. School resource officers are trained members of each public school's risk assessment team for this purpose. This collaboration is intended to be restorative and service-driven, not punitive, while providing all students with a pathway to success.
So I reviewed this slide in risk prevention overview as well, but that collaboration is mostly to provide pertinent information to assist in the risk assessment when we're working with our law enforcement partners as part of that risk assessment process. For them to be able to intervene if an imminent safety risk exists, that's towards self and others, and to assist in the safety planning for the student of concern at any specific targets that the student of concern or the student who made the threat has identified as potentially being violent or aggressive towards. If a patrol officer, and I talked about this a few weeks ago, or a school resource officer conducts their own investigation, this is a separate process from the school's risk assessment. Okay. So the team will review the initial cause for concern. If during this preliminary conversation, the risk prevention team determines that a risk assessment is appropriate given the situation, the process begins. And on the slide are the different components of the threat to others and concerning behaviors risk assessment. Administrators always lead this risk assessment when there is a situation involving a threat to others or concerning behaviors. There are 6 steps or 6 components in the risk assessment process. The first is triage, and that screening, that preliminary screening we talked about in risk prevention overview, refers to ensuring immediate safety and examining that initial information as to whether a risk assessment is necessary given the contextual factors and the totality of the circumstances. The second is gathering relevant history. That involves the review of records and other historical data. Relevant history could include class schedule, grades, transfer records, special education records, discipline history, bullying and harassment allegations, MTSS interventions and supports, previous risk assessments, interpersonal problems, significant life stressors that the team is aware of, known grievances or other motives that could present risk for violent aggressive behavior. This information is used to identify patterns of behaviors and vulnerabilities and indicators that an individual may be on the pathway towards violence. Sergeant Brett Choice reviewed common vulnerabilities of those that may be drawn to pathway behaviors and also common indicators that serve as warning signs that someone may already be on the pathway towards violence. That is why we collect relevant history to identify those patterns of behaviors. We also select interview questions that involves pulling the team together to pick key questions that assist with evaluating risk and also assist in finding the root cause of the issue. Conducting the interviews, the process of meeting with the student, eliciting the concern, any witnesses to that behavior, that relationship or to that conflict that may have prompted this violent or aggressive behavior or comment, and any identified targets of the threat. This is done in order to gather additional facts and information, get to know the students better, and to help develop an appropriate safety plan moving forward and case management plan. Classifying risk level is last after the summarization of findings. For threat to others and concerning behaviors, the whole team reconvenes to classify risk. This is a multidisciplinary approach, and therefore an entire team needs to be present to ascertain the totality of the circumstances and ascertain risk and follow-up procedures relevant to that risk level. A question that we often get is, what do the interviews look like, right? So the adults that are involved in the risk assessment interviews are, as stated earlier, the administrator, a mental health clinician, support staff if necessary, and SRO if appropriate, which is not always the case. The interviews that are completed are with the student making the threat, engaging in the concerning behavior, any witnesses to the event, any identified targets, if present and appropriate, and all interviews should be conducted in a conversational approach, and it is not meant to be interrogated. The risk prevention teams are afforded interview probes that are attempting to get to the root of the problem and uncover the possible solutions and/or protective factors that may be useful in the future safety planning and case management for that child and their potential intended targets, if that's present. The interviews focus on relationships, how I'm interacting with people, life stressors impacting behavior, current and previous emotional states that might influence judgment in future interactions, the student's social life and level of connectedness to the family, friends, and school community. We'll be looking at potentially aggression, bullying, and violent extreme ideologies. And lastly, the student's current ability to cope with life stressors and the overall level of resilience that the student demonstrates in the face of adversity, challenges, and disappointment. All of these questions or interview probes that the school team is provided are really trying to get at how we can support this child and get them off the pathway to violence if they are on. So that's what these questions are for. Once background information has been gathered and interviews completed, the risk prevention team reconvenes to synthesize all the information and classify level of risk. The factors that are considered as part of this multidisciplinary conversation are the nature, type of risk posed, the capability of that student keep carrying out the threat that they are communicating or continuing to engage in the concerning behavior. So does that student have the capability to pose a future threat? The imminence of the threat posed, the severity of the outcome if the threat were to come to fruition, and then ultimately the overall probability of the occurrence, taking into account all circumstances. And lastly, protective factors that that student already has that mitigates overall risks, such as strong family connection, affiliation with extracurricular activities, good interpersonal skills. We'll also be looking at those protective factors that we talked about in the risk prevention overview in part one, as a means of case management and also to how they would mitigate any risks that exist in that situation. On the slide are the risk classification labels for threat to others and concerning behaviors. As you can see, they're on a continuum, and each label has a set of corresponding required follow-up responses. The slide does not show all the follow-up and required responses. However, it does provide a general description of the follow-up of intensity and cadence that the case management should look like if a risk assessment were to yield certain risk levels. So if a risk assessment were to take place and it was determined to be no risk, there would be no follow-up and case closed. Often that would mean that there's clearly no risk to that threat coming to fruition, or the student has absolutely no means of carrying out that threat. A lower risk classification, the student may benefit from short-term limited intervention, but even in those cases, the case would be considered closed. All cases moderate, high, and critical remain open because they present a substantial risk to someone in the school community. So for moderate or undetermined risk, you may benefit from support or intervention, and additional information or investigation may be needed to get a better understanding of where that risk classification is. High substantial risk would include regular, periodic, intermittent monitoring with support and intervention, and critical imminent risk, regular ongoing monitoring and support and intervention. Now, the support and case management is going to look different depending on the student and the situation in the school. And we're going to get into those differences shortly. Just a quick review of records and confidentiality. If you are not able to attend part 1 of the risk prevention series, records and confidentiality so was already reviewed, but as a reminder for those not familiar, risk assessments are kept in a confidential file outside of the student's cumulative file. They are not kept in the student's cumulative file. It is separate. They are kept with the building administrator in a secure and confidential location. Risk assessments do not follow students outside of Fairfax County Public Schools or after graduation. Okay. This is need to know information and is kept confidential due to the sensitive nature of the information gathered of your student. So once information has been collected and the risk prevention team has determined level of risk, the team is required to engage in follow-up procedures that are geared towards prevention. Again, we are preventing something that has not happened yet. The threat that's been made has not come to fruition, so it is still prevention. We are preventing concerning behaviors from continuing. So risk assessments are part of preventative measures at FCPS. And there are general follow-up procedures that are always followed, which we'll get into in a minute, and then particular follow-up and case management for schools and caregivers, which we'll go through separately. This slide will look familiar to those who participated in last week's suicide prevention webinar. If you haven't watched part 2, I highly encourage you to carve out some time to review that important topic of suicide prevention. So after the risk assessment, regardless of risk level, caregivers are contacted always, and next steps to support the child will be discussed. Violence prevention is a collective responsibility. Caregiver and school collaborative efforts are essential to student safety and wellness. This collaboration generally will require the school to provide a review of the child's risk assessment, next steps taken by the school, the recommendations that school have for the caregiver to ensure safety, and the space to answer any questions on either side of the table by caregiver or by the school. But you will always be notified once the risk assessment and risk classification have been determined. Okay, so first we're going to be looking at case management and what that might look like at the school level. So generally, follow-up and case management will include communication with the parent caregiver, again, potentially referrals to appropriate community resources, which we have reviewed in our previous risk prevention series parts. We discussed these steps, but the following slides are more focused on school-based interventions and supports via the MTSS process. And through the next few slides, we're going to capture many of the possible steps the school can take to ensure safety. This is by no means an exhaustive list moving forward. And additionally, not every intervention that I'm going to talk about or procedural step that I'm going to review is appropriate for every situation. So every child is different and every situation is unique. So the ability to remain creative when differentiating the support plan, focused on the root cause of the problem, remains essential to all case management and support plans. It is mandatory, like I already said, for schools to provide in-school support for students who have participated in risk assessment, threat to others, and concerning behaviors that yield moderate high or critical risk classifications. That's mandatory. If your child, it just might look different depending on the child and depending on the situation. For example, again, this is not an exhaustive list and not all of these steps will be appropriate, but for example, if your child is demonstrating academic challenges that have impacted their ability to navigate school stressors and may have prompted them to engaging in these types of aggressive or violent behaviors, the school team may reconvene the local screening community to review potential evaluation or other supports that may be put in place to help support your child's wellness at school. If your child demonstrates crisis cycle behaviors, the school may implement a crisis plan in collaboration with you, the teacher, and the student eliciting concern. A student support plan created with the student eliciting concern is regularly done and will increase collaboration with your child and the school to allow the team to get to know their strengths, weaknesses, and the particular warning signs that they may be becoming emotionally dysregulated. The mental health practitioners at the school may determine that a skill deficit in self-awareness, self-management, relationship skills, or communication may be a barrier to your child's wellness. In response to this, social emotional interventions and or supports targeting that skill deficit may be part of the case management plan for your student. If this is a long ongoing behavior, your child is engaging in several risk assessments and interventions that have been put in place have not proven to be working as effectively as the team would hope and as you would hope. The team may determine a functional behavioral assessment is appropriate to better determine the function of your child's behavior that is being addressed or the unmet need that they are experiencing. This may result in a behavior intervention plan being put into place so the adults interacting with your child are on the same page with how to intervene and manage the behavioral challenges your student may be facing or those unmet needs that the school is attempting to meet through this problem-solving process. If during the risk assessment, your child has cited bullying and harassment as a grievance or motive for their behaviors, additional investigations through the school would pursue those claims as part of their response plan. Additionally, whenever there is risk to safety of a target, notification of intended targets and caregivers of targets are required as part of the case management and follow-up procedures after the risk assessment always. There may be short-term or long-term, depending on the severity of the situation, increased supervision of the student eliciting concern to ensure safety of that student and the school community. The school may increase its efforts to build your child's connectedness at school by facilitating healthy social interactions through interest groups at the school or even mentorship opportunities. Again, this is not an exhaustive list and not all of these would be relevant, needed, or appropriate given the factors of the particular case. These are some examples of what might happen through case management. So as stated earlier, violence prevention is a collective responsibility. The school will have referrals and recommendations for you as caregivers in order to maintain safety. The next slide, again, is not an exhaustive list and not all recommendations will be appropriate, but it's something that you may be, that those parents of children who are going through risk assessments may be requested to do. A big and very important request is to ensure restriction of access to means. If your child mentioned the use of a firearm, or if a child mentioned the use of a firearm, the team would request additional firearm safety measures. If a child mentioned a knife, the team would request ensuring your child does not have access to those items and potentially even checking their backpack before departing school to ensure that those items are not hidden away in the backpack. Research shows that the majority of those that engaged in targeted violence obtained their weapon legally. Okay, so through access to a parent's firearm, a gift from a family member, a neighbor, a friend. As caregivers, keep your firearms safely stowed Sergeant Choice will be reviewing appropriate measures to ensure firearm safety shortly. The team may also recommend you explore outside counseling services if your student has demonstrated additional need that the school is unable to meet. In high-risk situations, the school may be required to provide a referral for emergency mental health assessment to ensure continued safety and that clearly that support that that the child needs to be mentally well. We might also ask you to increase your supervision and monitoring of your student or of the student if they have demonstrated risky behaviors or inappropriate connections or unhealthy relationships. This is especially important with our students' digital lives. Students engaging in threatening behaviors or posting concerning statements might require this additional level of supervision at home to ensure that they are making good choices online and that they are not being taken advantage of by people who might be trying to elicit certain behaviors from them over the internet. During these times, the relationship between caregiver and school is crucial. Okay, so an increase in collaboration and communication will be a typical aspect of any case management plan after a threat to others concerning behaviors risk assessment. If you are able to secure outside supports for your child, you may be asked to sign a release of information. This is done so the mental health support at the school and the mental health support outside of the school are always on the same page with safety planning and support. This is the easiest way for wraparound support for your child to be ensured. The team may also ask you to increase efforts to build protective factors such as opportunities to practice appropriate coping strategies at home, increase participation in extracurricular activities, increase time spent exercising or being creative as part of a family. Part one of the risk prevention series went into more in depth of how caregivers can support the development of protective factors in their children. I encourage you to review that overview where Marcia Berry, school psychologist supervisor, reviews available community resources. Some emergency and non-emergency resources are on the slide. Again, both part 1 and 2 of the series dove into this topic. Emergency resources are to be used for the crisis situations. The concerns, even if they're non-crisis, will still warrant follow-up with non-emergency services. Another non-emergency resource consideration may be through your place of employment or employee wellness programming.
Firearm safety. The leading cause of death to teens in the U.S. involves a firearm. Interest in firearms are not abnormal for children as they routinely are seen in pop culture. Explaining firearm safety to children is paramount while restricting access. Virginia law makes it a criminal offense to leave a loaded, unsecured firearm where it can be accessed by children 14 years or younger. A simple method in firearm safety is to always ensure firearms are secure. When possible, firearms should be kept unloaded in a safe with the ammunition stored separately. The Fairfax County Community Services Board can provide you with free resources that can help you lock medications and firearms. You can access these resources through the link when these slides are shared after the presentation. The CSB can provide you with free trigger locks for firearms or cable locks and medication lock boxes.
Thank you, Sergeant Choice. So we've gone through what schools are doing within their building and what caregivers may be recommended. So on the slide is an example of what a student support plan may look like in response to a risk assessment that yielded an elevated risk level. Student safety planning completed with your child to identify trusted adults within the school may be a course of action that the school takes. weekly check-ins with school-based mental health professionals that affords them the opportunity to identify trusted adults, practice coping strategies, and identify known triggers. With consent from the caregiver, of course, connecting your student with interest groups to help facilitate social connectedness and build protective factors that support that resiliency, because life can be challenging. So part of building protective factors is also being able to be resilient in times of adversity. Outside of school, the recommendations may be for the parent to agree to keep firearms safe locked and change the combination to one the child is not privy to. We may encourage the parent to start exploring outside mental health supports available in your community. We might encourage the parent to be committed to increase monitoring of their child's social media and internet usage. To facilitate this collaboration, both school team and caregivers would agree to regular updates and communication schedules, and for parents to sign release of information. So mental health staff at the school, such as counselors, school psychologists, and social workers, are able to connect and contact healthcare providers directly for that ongoing case management, progress monitoring, and in times of crisis. So we're nearing the end of our violence prevention presentation, and I want to leave you with some general but very important information. Effective interventions that prevent violence are those that build protective factors that foster resilience, like I've said several times already, such as coping strategies when faced with adversity and having trusted adults to turn to when your child is in trouble or in their hurt or they're in pain. Practices that promote a positive climate or culture, such as creating an environment that promotes inclusion rather than division and compassion rather than fear and hate. Interventions that focus on healthy relationship building and engaging in behaviors that foster feelings of connectedness rather than isolation. As we consider these facts, this is what the research shows is effective in preventing violence. I really want us to take some time to consider some of the following as adults. I want us to reflect on what we are modeling for our children. In risk prevention overview, we talked about self-care, we talked about risk factors, and we talked about protective factors. What language are we using when we're angry, disappointed, hurt, or upset? What are our children observing when we cope with conflict with a loved one, a colleague, a neighbor? How are we coping with our own stressors? What are we promoting with our own behavior? Reflecting, being mindful of, and shifting if necessary, our own behaviors and coping skills can act as a protective factor for our children. What are they seeing? In part 2 of risk prevention, Bethany Demers, mental health and wellness specialist, talked about how our children's brains are not fully developed until their mid-20s. Reflect what our children are being exposed to online and over media. Is it messages of connectedness, resiliency, and positive behavior? If not, we should limit their access to those outlets and have discussions about what they're seeing and hearing and how it bothers them. They are impressionable. They are children. Lastly, reflect how we are promoting a positive climate and culture amongst each other and at school and in the community. If you have specific concerns regarding your child, there are school-based mental health professionals available to partner with you in navigating barriers and accessing supports and resources. Please reach out to your school-based counselors, psychologists, and social workers and substance abuse specialists as appropriate. That is the end of the presentation for violence prevention.